What looks like a family stroll is really the beginning of an odyssey. Carrying the few possessions they hold dear, and some wearing only flip-flops on their feet, these Venezuelans are on their way home. They came to Colombia seeking a better life. But ever since the coronavirus forced the country into lockdown, it has become increasingly difficult for Venezuelan migrants to make ends meet.
My husband lost his job. He was laid off and we lost our home. That's why we decided to return.
I want to leave, but I also want to stay. The quarantine is hard, even for Colombians. There's no work. How are we supposed to pay our rent? How are we supposed to buy food?
It's hard for me because I left everything behind in Venezuela to start over in Colombia. Now I have to leave it all behind again to start anew over there. I don't know what to expect. We'll see how it goes.
On their way out of Bogotá, the returnees receive care packages provided by the United Nations Refugee Agency. Nobody knows when they'll get their next meal. With the country under quarantine, the unofficial pit stops along the way have shut down. It's a dangerous trip they're embarking on. For hundreds of kilometers, they'll have to navigate adverse weather conditions and armed groups controlling rural areas. Worried about their well-being, 8 organizations try to convince the migrants to stay.
When they cross the border with Venezuela, they'll have to quarantine. That's another challenge. In Venezuela, the conditions for placing a large amount of people under lockdown aren't ideal. That's why the UNHCR and other agencies, in coordination with the Colombian government, are discouraging returns.
But not everybody wants to leave. Helen and her family arrived in Bogotá 2 months ago, on foot. Despite the difficulties they face in Colombia, the young mother doesn't want to risk venturing back to Venezuela.
I prefer to stay. What are we going to do in Venezuela? We may have a house of our own, but am I supposed to wait for my daughter to starve to death? Back home, she was hospitalized with malnourishment. They told my father to start arranging the funeral because she was practically dead.
With the little money they had spent on food, Helen and her family couldn't pay this month's rent. Unable to work during the lockdown, they risk being kicked out by their landlord. Desperate, Helen's stepfather pleads for solidarity.
I beg the Colombian government to help us out with the rent payments. That's one way they could assist us. Because we're human beings, we're not animals.
But many of their fellow Venezuelans have already lost faith in the authorities coming to the rescue. Tired of being treated like second-class citizens during the pandemic, they have decided to leave. Returning to Venezuela with a political crisis still underway may not have been what they planned. But if they make it, at least they'll be at home.
Straight to the capital then. Correspondent Oscar Schlenker joins us from Caracas. Welcome, Oscar. As Venezuelans return home because of the pandemic, what sort of conditions will they encounter?
Well, the healthcare system in Venezuela is at its worst, and it's one of the reasons for the humanitarian crisis we have been dealing with for the past couple of years. Not only are hospitals in most parts of the country practically in ruin, but there are no equipment, and many of the medical staff has migrated or left their job for more lucrative alternatives. But also the water and electricity shortages affect not only the health system, but everybody's living situation. And now with a gasoline shortage as well, it is crippling ambulance and transport in general. But for refugees coming back to Venezuela could be a better alternative than staying at a camp, especially when neighboring countries are all quarantined. There are no jobs, everything is closed. So for many of them, it's better to stay at home in Venezuela than in a tent or a camp somewhere else. I do believe that if there is more economic gain in leaving, then people will start migrating again once things seem to be back to normal.
It truly does sound desperate. Looking at the pandemic, the official figures are surprising. 189 COVID-19 cases in Venezuela and 9 deaths. whereas neighbouring Colombia has registered nearly 3,000 cases. So one wonders, how credible are the figures from the Maduro government?
There is little credibility on the figures given by Maduro's team. In fact, the opposition-led parliament headed by Juan Guaidó has criticized the lack in accurate information. But it's difficult to calculate how many actual infected there are. We have not seen, however, a significant surge in deaths in the morgue, and death figures are hard to hide. So some experts attribute the low numbers in comparison to other countries to how isolated Venezuela was before the coronavirus outbreak. The political and economic crisis practically shut down our airport in many occasions. Many companies like Lufthansa and American Airlines have stopped flying altogether to Venezuela since last year. So even though the figures given by Maduro are not credible, we suspect the numbers are not as high as in other countries. However, the regime is using the pandemic to persecute opposition. And with that excuse, we have seen a surge in detentions towards politicians and journalists covering coronavirus in Venezuela.
Oscar Schlenker in Caracas, thank you.